This week's teaching comes from the 40th division of the Torah portions, and this week's portion is Balak. And it's from Numbers chapter 22, verse 2, all the way through 25, verse 9. And there's a couple of interesting things in my mind about this portion in particular. Number one, the entire narrative this week is actually from the perspective of Israel's enemy. And this is actually the first time we've had an out of Israel experience about Israel, really since early Exodus, late Genesis. So I think that's kind of an interesting point alone. Number two, this is the second time in Scripture where we find that there's communication between an animal and an individual in the Bible. And I want you to think about, with this being the second, what was the first one? So we're going to do a little bit of comparison and contrast there between these two. And yeah, like I said, this is from Numbers 22, verse 2, all the way through 25, verse 9. And what's going on as a precursor, what's happened in development to bring us where we are now. Israel had a couple of major victories against Sihon and Og. And the reason why that's imperative to understand is they were really the might and the muscle of the territory of the region. They were the enforcers. And the fact that Israel was able to come along and topple them off their throne meant a lot of bad business for everybody else. And as a result, there is a king by the name of Balak. Yes, Balak, named after this portion. The portion's named with. He's sweating at the brow, he's sweating at the crown, because he knows it's just going to be a matter of time before that same lot falls into his lap. He's going to share a similar destruction, and he's heartbroken. He's devastated. He is absolutely empty. And if you know me, one of the things I love to do is take a look at the meanings of the name of characters, places, individuals, because that's a whole brilliant commentary in and of its own. And wouldn't you know that the name Balak actually comes from the word Balak, which means to lay waste, to be empty, or devastated. And that's exactly what he is in light of the news of the fall of Sihon and Og to the hands of Israel and the God of Israel. And so the solution to the problem, he decides, is to try to spiritually cut the legs out from underneath Israel. Because physically, if Sihon and Og can't go up against him, I don't have a snowball's chance in Hades of doing that. So what we're going to do is we're going to hire a spiritual assassin. We're going to hire a prophet to speak against the name and the people of Israel. And that's how we're going to seek our victory. We can't do it physically, at least not at first. So if we could curse the people, that's going to have to be the only way to go. And he consults with this man by the name of Balaam. And Balaam's a bit of an interesting character because seemingly, visually, optically, he's doing a lot of the right things. He's saying a lot of the right things. Balak sends a dispatchment to him, and he says, yeah, no thanks, really can't do much of anything. The party comes back to Balak, and Balak in turn sends princes to Balaam, and people who have more respect, more grandeur, more gifting, perhaps more gifts even respectively themselves, and sends them back. And in 22 verse 18, Balaam actually gives the answer I think would be spot on, gold sticker A+. He says, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or to do more. He knows his parameters. He knows what he's given. He knows exactly where the lane is, and that's what he can only operate in. He says, now therefore, please, you also stay here tonight that I may know more what the Lord will say to me. And it says, God came to Balaam at night and said to him, if the men call you, rise and go with them, but only the word in which I speak to you, that you shall do. So Balaam arose in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the princes of Moab. Now there's a commentary resource that I have that made a brilliant statement in regards to Balaam. And like I said, at this point, you don't see a lot about him that's really too terribly bad. It's an odd story, for sure. But in this commentary, he made mention that he almost has like this Judas essence to him, or this almost Judas spirit. Whereas, think of Judas. Go to the Gospels. He was one of the 12 disciples. He followed Jesus around. He was publicly there with so many of the miracles. He was treasurer. A lot of eyes were on him. And it seemed like he was in good company. He was doing the right thing. But behind the scenes, what was Judas's heart? You and I already know that, yeah, behind the scenes, he was selling off his savior, his master, his rabbi for 30 pieces of silver. While he had a lot of optics that were A plus, thumbs up, right on, spiritually speaking, he was trying to deal a heavy blow. He was doing a lot of damage. But for the right price, we'll turn what looks good and make some dirty hands. And when you get to the very next verse in chapter 22 of the book of Numbers, we get verse 22. It says, "Then God's anger was aroused because he went. And the angel of the Lord took his stand as an adversary against him." Well, God said he could go. Why is he mad? Look at the company he's going along with. They're no different than the group of peoples who were going to arrest Jesus all the way in the garden. They had nefarious purposes. These people did, these princes. They wanted to seek the destruction of Israel, and for the right price, essentially, he went. And what I find interesting about this story here, Balaam has this comment where he's the eye that sees and he has the open eye, and it says he has a couple servants with him, and of course they're with the cloud of princes and all that. But they get to this point, they get to like this field, they get to the vineyard, and what happens is the donkey sees what's going on when nobody else does. And so the donkey decides, yeah, we're not doing this today. And he veers off the path and he goes between these two fences in this vineyard, these walls. She does, this donkey. And all of a sudden, there's the angel with the sword in the hand yet again. And so she kind of presses against the wall and winds up crushing Balaam's foot. Balaam gets hacked off about this, reactionary. I think I could understand that one. And then he tells the donkey to go forward. And what does the donkey do at that point? The donkey sits down. Not going to go anywhere because the donkey sees, yeah, somebody's head's on the chopping block here. I don't want anything to do with this. So it says Balaam strikes the donkey, hits her upside the head, and all of a sudden her tongue's loosed, and she's, why do you do this to me? Have I not been a good donkey for you the entire time you've had me? Do you not see? And then Balaam all of a sudden has his eyes open to the fact of what reality is here. Now, as I mentioned, this is number 2 of 2 of where we find an animal talking to a person in Scripture. What is the first occasion of this happening? Well, go all the way back, as I make the habit of doing. Let's go back to the beginning of the beginning. Let's go back to the other garden, the Garden of Eden. What happens there? Turns out there's this serpent who comes up and speaks these words to Eve. And in the Hebrew text, this serpent speaks 26 words to her. And this serpent is hoping to bring death, destruction, and enmity between mankind and its creator, the creator of it all. Coincidentally, how many words are spoken in the Hebrew between this donkey and Balaam? It's actually not 26, it's 23. But for all sakes and purposes, I will include these 3 nonverbal items of turning off the path, turning into the wall, sitting down. There's 3 actions that the donkey does to help preserve or save its life, whoever's life, what have you. So 23 plus 3 also winds up being this number of 26. And what's interesting is you find all the way in the back in the beginning in the garden, that's to bring death, destruction, enmity. Whereas in the case of Balaam, we actually find what? We actually find this donkey is actually bringing preservation to the life of Balaam. You have Adam and Eve who are created by God to be holy, set aside, have their own purpose and righteousness. You have somebody coming up against them in the form of the serpent trying to bring death to that. You have Balaam who was hired for wicked, nefarious purposes, who possibly deserves death for what he's trying to get himself intermingled with. And we find that this guy on a donkey winds up, the donkey's trying to bring preservation. And what's interesting too is whenever you take the most holy name of God in the Hebrew, what we translate into English as either Yahweh or Jehovah. In Hebrew, it's known as a tetragrammaton, Yud, He, Vav, He. And if you were to take the numeric values of Yud, He, Vav, He, you have 10, 5, 6, 5, or that is also 26. And it's interesting that, all of creation is created by Yud, He, Vav, He, which equals 26. And it's exactly 26 words that the serpent uses to bring death and destruction and try to unhinge, uncoil, unravel all of this goodness and bring disruption and chaos into the world. And it makes me think of last week's Torah portion where I was talking about, you have the fiery serpents that come up and they're snatching at the people, and people are falling at waste, they're falling and they're dying. And they tell Moses, hey, we don't want this anymore. What do we do? The solution was to create this Nachashet, this bronze serpent, put it on a pole, and lift it up in front of the people. That problem became the solution. And it's interesting, too, because you have everybody dying because of these serpents. The last thing they want to look at, stare at, gaze at is yet another serpent. And that's exactly what they had to look at to wind up surviving through the sin and the chaos. That was the cure. And I had mentioned about how in Greek there is a word called pharmakon, which means both poison and cure. And what's interesting on that is you take a look at Nachash. The word serpent in Hebrew is 356. Well, guess what? Coincidentally, you have the word for Messiah in the Hebrew, Mashiach, and it is the exact numeric equivalent of Nachash, 356. So you have this whole... Okay, so take that back. It's 358, not 356. I was like, where am I getting 6 from? But yeah, you have Nachash, which has a total of the 358, whereas Messiah has this same exact numeric equivalent of 358. And so you find all the loss is brought back into perfect balance with the Messiah. But taking a look back at this relationship that Balaam and Balak had, eventually they do wind up meeting one another, and all of a sudden, here's what we're going to do. You're going to curse Israel. And all of a sudden, Balaam opens his mouth to start speaking these lavish curses against Israel, but all of a sudden it's converted into goodness. It's converted to greatness. It's something that really hacks off Balak, because he's like, what are you doing? I'm giving you this gold, this silver, this money, all of these things. I'm giving this to you so that you may curse them, not bless them. All of a sudden, they're better off now than before you ever shown up onto the scene. You're not looking at this right. So they travel to another location. They set up altars. They do sacrifices. And he's like, all right, here we go. Curse the people. And Balak does exactly what he says in Numbers 22. I can only speak what God puts in my mouth to speak. And all of a sudden, Balak gets hacked off again. And this happens in a sequence of 3 or 4 times. And as a matter of fact, these blessings that were supposed to be curses are so good. They are of such magnitude that literally in Jewish history, they have actually considered putting Balaam's quote-unquote curses as a part of their daily liturgy and their daily blessings because of the magnitude of how good these blessings are. And the only reason they haven't, or the only reason they don't, is because of the sheer amount of wording, the acreage that they would have to be saying. Its value, its length. The length of the blessings is the only thing of why it's not a part of the daily liturgy of their own people, which I find to be fascinating. But like I said, Balak just realizes he's out of steam, he's devastated, he's empty out, just much like his name implies. And he's heartbroken, because you take a look at Balaam's name, comes from Bala, which means to swallow up, and in a lot of essence, it's like Korah. Korah was a part of the Kohathites. What they would do, what their God-given responsibility was, is they were to cover up or swallow up anything that's holy and preserve it. It was not something common, so you had to treat it as holy. And then you take a look at the end of Balaam's name, the Am, that Am, that means kinsman, that means people. And so, literally, Balak wanted Balaam to be somebody who would swallow up the people, cause some type of curse that would basically, kind of like what happened with Korah, to be swallowed up, where there'd be no remnants or anything to really remember them by so much of. And yet Balaam says, I can't verbally curse these people because they are blessed by God. And I think that's something tremendous to look at. If they are indeed blessed by God, there's nothing I can say, and there's nothing that I myself can physically do to regurgitate anything on them. It's like the book of Isaiah says, no weapon formed against them shall prosper. There's nothing we can do. But then the New Testament also gives us a little bit of light that there was advice that Balak was given by Balaam that made all the world of difference to them. And like I said, like he said, there's nothing that we can do, but it's more on the fact of what they can do. I think so much of Joseph and the whole situation that happened with him. Betrayed by brothers, betrayed by so many people who he was either close with in relation or within proximity to. And heartbreak after heartbreak, everything that they meant as evil towards him, God was able to use as good for good purposes. But there was also this option that Joseph had. He was betrayed by his brethren. He had the knife in his back in that regard. Moved forward with life. He was sold as a slave. He was put into the pit. And then all of a sudden he was brought back up out of the pit. He was sold as a slave. And then he was brought into the house of Potiphar. And he had an option. Because what had happened, he gained Potiphar's trust. He had this Midas touch. Everything he touched turned to gold, it seemed like. There was nothing bad that could happen just as long as Joseph was there. But what had happened? Potiphar had a wife, and Potiphar's wife had eyes for Joseph. And there was an opportunity that if he wanted to be with Mrs. Potiphar, she was more than willing and absolutely made itself known. But he had this spiritual integrity of himself and said, I cannot do that to my master. And he fled. Well, when he fled, he left his garment in hand of Mrs. Potiphar. She accused him of attempting to accost her. And all of a sudden, we're back down the roller coaster again to lower levels than we've ever felt before. And we know the story at the end of it talks about how everything that you meant as evil, everything that was used as evil against me, God used as good. But there was the option that Joseph had where he could have fallen to his master's wife. When it comes to Balaam and Balak, what was the counsel, what was the advice that Balaam had given Balak? I can't say anything against these people, but you know what's going to work? Self-sabotage. Our greatest enemies aren't our coworkers, people who are seeking promotions, people who want to use this as stepping stones. Our enemies aren't always the people who are in other industries. Sometimes the biggest deficit that we can encounter and that we can face in our progression is us ourselves. Because self-sabotage does a lot more damage than what most other people probably could. There's not a person listening to this or could hear this who's not 2 or 3 really bad decisions away from ruining their own life, much less a lot of people's that they love. All I've got to do is throw back a couple of good-sized bottles of some strong enough drink and get behind the wheel of a car. I can destroy my life, I can destroy my family's life, and I can destroy the life of people I've never even met. All that takes is a couple of really bad decisions. And Balaam's advice to Balak was let them self-sabotage. And where Joseph got it right in turning down the sexual advances of his master's wife, Israel, unfortunately, they went the wrong way. And we'll actually find at the end of this portion, in the beginning of next week's portion, that self-sabotage took form of sexual idolatry. And they were so brazen, they were committing these acts right in front of the open tabernacle of God. They were that in the face about it. And so while they were immensely blessed by this whole conspiracy between Balak and Balaam, there was a very much a case of being brought very low because of this temptation. And so hopefully this didn't end a little too heavy in the levity of what we had before, but hopefully there's been some stuff that you could think on, And hopefully I've challenged you a little bit. So until next time, thank you for your time. Be blessed.